The sun sat low over the horizon, its fading light spilling across the dry earth and painting the village in hues of orange and red. Evening was supposed to be a time of rest, when families gathered around their fires, when children's laughter carried across the air, and when elders shared stories to remind the people of who they were. But on this day, the atmosphere was heavy with something darker. Instead of laughter, silence pressed against every hut. Instead of the warmth of stories, there was the biting cold of fear. For the tribe had been called to gather in the center, summoned not by choice but by command. At the heart of the circle stood a young woman, her body trembling though she tried to hold herself upright. She was slender, her frame delicate but her spirit strong, at least until now. Her dark hair fell across her face in tangled strands, partly hiding the tears that clung to her cheeks. She dared not look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, not because of guilt but because of shame. Shame forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. Before her stood the man who had given her life, her father, towering over her with the cruel authority of a man who believed his will was law. He held in his hand a leather strap, thick and worn from years of use. It had been a tool for breaking horses, for disciplining boys, and for making his power known. Today he had chosen to wield it against his own daughter. His voice rose above the hushed whispers of the crowd. "She has defied me," he barked, his words sharp like stones. "She has refused the marriage I arranged, a union that would have brought honor to our family. Instead, she has spoken against me, shamed me before others. A daughter who shames her father must learn her place." The villagers shuffled uneasily, eyes flicking between father and daughter. Some pitied the girl, but none dared intervene. The father was a man of influence, known for his temper, and feared for his ruthlessness. To oppose him would be to invite ruin. The elders kept their heads bowed, unwilling to challenge tradition. The women clutched their children close, whispering for them not to watch. But the children did watch, wide-eyed, learning an unspoken lesson about power, fear, and silence. The girl's knees shook, but she tried to steady herself. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I will not marry him." Her voice was small, almost drowned by the murmurs of the crowd, but it reached her father's ears, and his face contorted with rage. "Defiance even now?" he thundered, and before anyone could breathe, the strap came down. The sound cracked through the air like lightning splitting a tree. The girl gasped as pain shot across her back, forcing her to stumble forward. Dust rose around her feet, clinging to her skin where the lash had struck. The crowd flinched collectively, some turning their heads away, but still no one moved. Another lash followed, and another. Each one left a mark not only on her body but on the hearts of those who watched. Yet the father's arm did not falter. His pride demanded a spectacle. He wanted the entire village to see his authority, to see that no one, not even his own flesh and blood, could escape his control. Her cries pierced the evening air, sharp and raw, a sound that would linger in the minds of the listeners long after the whipping ceased. The villagers felt the weight of her suffering, but fear sealed their lips. A few men clenched their fists in anger, yet they did not step forward. A few women wept silently, yet they did not raise their voices. Tradition was a chain heavier than any iron, and it kept them bound to silence. The girl fell to her knees, her palms sinking into the dirt as she tried to support herself. Her hair spilled around her face, mixing with tears and dust, her breath ragged as she gasped between sobs. The strap struck again, her back arching with the force, her voice breaking into a scream that echoed off the huts. She felt as if her body was unraveling, each lash peeling away her dignity, each moment stripping her of her place among her people. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a young woman of the tribe. She was reduced to an example, a warning, a lesson carved into flesh for others to witness. Her father's face showed no mercy. His eyes blazed with prideful fury, his jaw set like stone. He wanted her broken, wanted the spark of resistance extinguished forever. He believed this was strength, that control was the essence of honor, that obedience was worth more than love. But in truth, he was blinded by his arrogance, too lost in his rage to see the cruelty of his actions. At the edges of the crowd, whispers began to spread. Some murmured prayers for the girl's endurance. Others muttered about the father's cruelty, voices low but sharp with anger. But still fear reigned. None dared to stop him. None dared to say the word, enough. It seemed the girl would be left alone to endure this torment until her father's rage had burned itself out. The girl's vision blurred as her tears mixed with dust. Her body trembling so violently she thought her bones might shatter. Her spirit wavered, teetering on the edge of collapse. A voice inside her begged her to submit, to whisper a false promise of obedience just to end the pain. But another voice, quieter, buried deep, refused. That voice told her that she was more than a pawn, more than her father's tool. That voice told her to endure, not because she deserved this suffering, but because to surrender completely would be to lose herself. And though she was being beaten before her people, though her dignity was dragged through the dust, some part of her clung stubbornly to that inner flame. The sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, shadows stretching long across the ground. The whip still cracked, her father's fury still poured out, and the crowd still stood frozen. Yet within this brutal moment, the air itself seemed to grow tense, as if something unseen stirred just beyond the circle. For though the father believed himself the master of this spectacle, another pair of eyes watched from among the silent witnesses. Eyes filled not with fear, but with something far stronger. And while the girl could not yet see it, her humiliation would not end in silence. For soon the humiliation that sought to break her would become the spark that changed everything. The night had grown colder, and the darkness deepened as the last of the sun's glow slipped beyond the horizon. The fire in the center of the village cast a trembling light, illuminating the circle of people who stood watching the cruel spectacle unfold. The air carried the smell of dust and sweat, mingled with the faint metallic tang of blood from the girl's wounds. She was still on her knees, her body trembling, shoulders bent from the weight of her father's punishment. Her cries had grown weaker, her voice hoarse, yet the whip had not stopped. Each lash seemed to echo louder in the silence of the gathering, until even the children buried their faces in their mothers' skirts, unable to bear the sight. Among the onlookers stood a man whose presence was both familiar and different. He was not a stranger, but he did not belong fully to the household of the girl's father. He was of the Apache, known among the people as a warrior whose reputation traveled beyond their lands. Broad shoulders stretched beneath a shirt worn thin from years of battle and travel, his chest scarred with reminders of countless fights. His long black hair hung loose, strands brushing across a face carved with strength, but it was his eyes that drew people to silence. They were not merely eyes that had seen war, they were eyes that judged, that weighed right and wrong with a fire that few could bear to meet. His name was spoken with both respect and caution. Some admired him for his fearlessness, others feared him for his unyielding defiance of injustice. He was a man who stood apart from the compromises of politics and the whispered bargains of leaders. Where he walked, honor walked with him, though it was often accompanied by the shadow of conflict. Tonight, he had not expected to find himself pulled into such a storm. He had come only to see, to stand among the people as they gathered, curious about the whispers of a father disciplining his daughter. But as his eyes fell upon the young woman at the center, he felt a tightening in his chest. He had noticed her before, not as a possession, not as a fleeting figure, but as a presence. He had seen her gather herbs at the riverbank, her hands gentle and patient as she searched among the stones. He had seen her laugh with other women, her voice carrying the warmth of life even in hard times. He had even seen her alone once, gazing across the wide plains with a look of longing as though she carried dreams too vast for the confines of the village. There had always been a quiet strength about her, something unbroken even when her duties weighed heavy. And now, to watch that same strength beaten into the dust before his eyes, struck him with a force deeper than any blade could pierce. At first, he stood still, forcing himself to watch. His instincts screamed for action, but he held back, measuring the moment. He knew well the weight of stepping between a father and his daughter, between a man and the customs of his people. Interference was no light matter. It would be seen as defiance not only of the father, but of the traditions that bound the tribe together. Still, as lash after lash fell, as the girl's spirit bent but did not fully break, the warrior's patience burned away like paper in flame. He saw not only her suffering, but the silence of the people. That silence cut him deeper than the sound of the whip. Men who could fight stood frozen. Elders who preached wisdom kept their eyes lowered. Women who bore their own scars whispered prayers but dared not speak aloud. Even the young boys who one day would call themselves warriors stood rooted in fear, learning the lesson of silence instead of courage. The injustice of it pressed against the Apache's chest until it felt like a weight he could no longer bear. He clenched his fists, the scars across his knuckles catching the firelight. He had fought battles against enemies with blades and arrows. But here was a battle of a different kind, one against cruelty, against pride, against the silence that allowed it to flourish. His jaw tightened as he whispered to himself, "No more." The whip cracked again, and this time the warrior moved. He stepped forward from the shadows of the circle, his boots pressing firmly into the dirt, his shoulders squared as though he carried the weight of 1,000 ancestors. The crowd parted slightly, startled by his boldness. Gasps slipped from lips, whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Eyes widened, for they knew that when this man moved, it was not without purpose. The father, mid-swing, caught sight of him. His arm froze, the strap dangling in the air. His glare locked onto the warrior, sharp and accusing. "What do you think you're doing?" The father spat, his voice trembling not from fear but from rage at being interrupted. The warrior did not answer immediately. He stepped into the circle, his eyes never leaving the girl who knelt in the dirt. Her face lifted slightly, her swollen eyes meeting his. For a moment it was as though the noise of the crowd, the crack of the whip, the tension of the night, all of it fell away. In her gaze he saw not just pain but a spark of endurance, faint but unextinguished. That was enough. He turned his face to the father, his voice carrying across the silence with a power that needed no shouting. "Enough." The word struck the air like a hammer against stone. It was not loud, yet it commanded the space, silencing even the murmurs. The father stiffened, his jaw twitching, his pride wounded by the challenge. "Enough?" he barked. "You dare tell me when I am finished with my own blood? She is my daughter. My authority is mine alone." His voice cracked with fury, but there was a tremor beneath it, a tremor born from the knowledge that this man standing before him was no ordinary challenger. The warrior took another step forward, his shadow cast long in the firelight. His voice deepened, steady as the earth itself. "I have seen men destroy their families with pride. I have seen injustice turn brother against brother, tribe against tribe. What you do here is not discipline. It is cruelty. You dishonor her and you dishonor yourself." The crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the two men. The father's face burned red, veins bulging in his neck. But the warrior did not flinch. He had chosen his place. He would stand between the girl and her tormentor no matter the cost. For he was the witness to her suffering, and he would not remain silent. The night was no longer just about the humiliation of a daughter. It was about the courage, or the lack of it, within the hearts of everyone who stood around that circle. And in that moment, as the warrior faced the father, it became clear that the tide of silence had met its first stone of defiance. The silence that followed the warrior's words was heavy, so heavy it pressed against the chest of every villager gathered in that circle. The crack of the whip had ceased, and for the first time since the punishment began, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the girl on the ground. Her father's hand still clutched the strap, his knuckles white, his eyes blazing with a fury that burned hotter than the firelight that flickered across his face. He was a man not used to being opposed. His word had always been law within his household, and even beyond it, his influence carried weight. To be challenged here before his people was more than an interruption. It was an insult to his pride, a public threat to the authority he had built his life upon. The warrior stood firm, broad shoulders squared, his chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm that contrasted the storm raging in the father's veins. His presence filled the space like a mountain rising against the horizon, immovable, unshaken. He had spoken only a single word, "Enough," but the echo of it lingered, refusing to be dismissed. The father sneered, lifting the whip again. "Step aside," he growled, his voice thick with contempt. "This is no concern of yours. You may be a fighter, Apache, but this is my blood, my daughter. She belongs to me. I will discipline her as I see fit." The warrior did not move. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Then in a voice that carried across the gathering with the weight of stone and steel, he spoke again. "She belongs to no one." The words cut through the air like a blade. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some gasped at his audacity. Others lowered their eyes, afraid to witness what would come next. The father's face twisted with rage, his pride struck at its core. "You dare tell me how to rule my house?" he shouted. "You dare to shame me before my own people?" The warrior stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his shadow now falling across the father. His gaze did not waver, his voice steady but infused with a power that made the ground itself seem to listen.
I do not seek to shame you.
You have done that yourself. What you call discipline is nothing but cruelty. What you call authority is pride dressed as honor. You raise your hand not to teach her but to break her, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy what is not yours to destroy. The father's chest heaved, his breath sharp with fury. He had expected fear, expected hesitation. But this man, this warrior, spoke as though he feared nothing, as though the weight of tradition and authority meant little compared to what he believed was right. For a heartbeat, the father's grip faltered, but his pride drove him forward. He raised the whip, his voice thundering, "Leave, or I will see you broken at my feet." The crowd sucked in their breath, waiting, expecting the warrior to retreat, to realize the danger of defying a father before his people. But the Apache did not step back. He stepped closer still, his voice dropping lower, deeper, but carrying all the more power for its calmness. "Strike her again, and you will not face a daughter's silence. You will face me." Gasps erupted among the villagers. The challenge had been spoken, and it was no longer merely words of protest, it was a direct confrontation, a line drawn in the dust between cruelty and courage. The father froze, his whip trembling in his hand. He searched the warrior's face for weakness, for hesitation, but he found none. What he saw instead was resolve, unyielding, immovable, the kind of resolve that had stared down enemies in battle and had not faltered. The girl lifted her head weakly, her swollen eyes locking onto the man who now stood between her and her father. In the depth of her exhaustion, something stirred, a faint spark of hope, fragile but real. For the first time, she was not alone in her suffering. Someone had spoken for her. Someone had stood for her. And that someone was not afraid. The father turned toward the crowd, desperate for support, his pride grasping for allies. "Will you allow this?" he demanded. "Will you let this man strip me of my rights, of my authority? He shames our customs, he shames our way of life." His voice rang with fury, but the villagers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. None stepped forward to support him. For though they feared the father, though they had once obeyed his authority, the warrior's words had struck something deeper, a truth they could not deny. The Apache saw the hesitation ripple through the crowd and seized the moment. His voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction, as if he were speaking not only to the father, but to every soul gathered there. "What is honor if it is built on the tears of your daughters? What is strength if it comes from breaking the weak? A father is meant to protect, not to destroy. And if no one else will say it, then I will. This is wrong. And wrong must be challenged." The crowd was silent, their hearts pounding with the weight of his words. For many, it was the first time anyone had dared to speak against the cruelty masked as discipline, the pride disguised as tradition. The father's face twisted, his authority slipping with each passing moment. He realized that to lash his daughter again now would not prove his power, but his weakness. To strike her in the face of such defiance would not restore his honor. It would strip it completely. The warrior stood unflinching, his eyes locked on the father, his body poised like a storm waiting to break. He was not merely protesting, he was challenging, daring the father to prove himself not with cruelty but with courage. Yet the father, for all his bluster, could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His daughter's humiliation had begun as his weapon, but now it threatened to become his downfall. The girl, still trembling, pushed herself slightly higher on her knees. Her body ached, her breath shallow, but she kept her eyes fixed on the two men before her. She could sense the change in the air, the turning of the tide. For the first time in her life, someone had stood in open defiance of her father. Someone had challenged him not with fear, but with truth. And in that moment, though she was still broken and bruised, she felt the first stirring of dignity returning to her heart. The circle of villagers waited, breathless, caught between two forces, pride and honor, cruelty and courage. The father's whip dangled uselessly in his hand, his authority crumbling with each passing second. And the warrior stood tall, the embodiment of defiance, his challenge echoing through the silence. This was no longer just a beating. This was a battle of spirits, and though no blood had been spilled, the challenge had already drawn its line, a line that could never be erased. The whip dangled from the father's hand, heavy now not with power but with the weight of indecision. The crowd's silence pressed against him like an unseen wall, and for the first time, he felt its judgment turning not against his daughter but against himself. His authority had been shaken, his pride wounded, and standing before him was a man who refused to bend, a warrior whose every word had struck like iron on stone. The fire between them crackled, the sparks leaping into the night sky, as though even the flames waited for what would come next. The Apache warrior's chest rose and fell steadily, his calm unshaken, his eyes burning with conviction. He had spoken the truth, had challenged cruelty with courage, but now he knew it was not enough to stand against the father. He had to give the girl something more, something that would not only shield her from this night but lift her beyond the shame and humiliation that had been forced upon her. She could not be left to return to her father's house, to be beaten again in the shadows once the crowd dispersed. She needed protection, and protection required a vow. Slowly, deliberately, the warrior extended his arm and pointed to the girl. She looked up at him through swollen eyes, her breath shaky, her body trembling from pain and exhaustion. His gaze softened for only a moment, enough to remind her that she was not alone. Then he turned back to her father, his voice carrying like thunder through the stillness. "Now she's mine." The words rolled through the crowd like a wave crashing against stone. Murmurs erupted, gasps filled the air. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men exchanged uneasy glances, and the elders stirred with restless frowns. The father's face went pale, then flushed crimson, his chest heaving with disbelief and rage. "Yours?" he spat, his voice cracking. "You dare claim my daughter before me? You dare to steal her from her blood, from her family?" The warrior did not flinch. "I steal nothing. She was never a possession to be owned, never a thing to be broken for pride. She is not yours to wield as a weapon against your own shame. If she chooses it, she will walk with me, not as a slave, not as a prize, but as my equal. From this moment forward, her dignity is under my protection, and if any hand is raised against her, it will have to pass through me." The girl's breath caught in her chest. She had expected nothing beyond his intervention, nothing beyond the courage he had already shown. Yet here he stood, declaring before the tribe, before her father, before the entire world she had known, that she was no longer a victim of cruelty. He had claimed her, not as property, but as partner, as companion, as someone worthy of respect. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not of pain this time, but of something new, something unfamiliar. Hope. The father shook with fury, his pride tearing at him like claws. "You dishonor me," he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "You strip me of my rights, of my authority, of everything that binds this family together. You would tear apart our customs with your arrogance. You would shame me before my people." The warrior stepped closer, his presence looming, his voice deep but steady. "No, you dishonor yourself. You speak of customs, but what custom demands cruelty? You speak of honor. But what honor is built on the tears of your child? You raise your hand in anger and call it discipline. You call it love, but it is pride. And pride has no honor when it destroys what it should protect." The villagers shifted, their whispers growing louder. They had watched the father's wrath countless times before, excused it as tradition, as authority, as the way things had always been. But tonight, in the presence of the Apache's unflinching truth, those excuses rang hollow. Their eyes flickered toward the girl, her bruised face, her trembling form, and then back toward the warrior who stood like a shield between her and further cruelty. For the first time, many began to see the father not as a man of strength, but as a man consumed by pride. The father looked around, desperate for support, but the eyes that met his held only doubt. He snarled, lifting the whip as though to strike the warrior. But even as he raised his hand, the weight of the moment crushed him. To strike now would be to lose everything, to show the tribe that his strength was nothing but desperation. His hand trembled, and slowly, bitterly, he lowered the strap. The Apache turned back to the girl. He extended his hand, palm open, his eyes steady. "You are free to choose," he said, his voice softer now but carrying just as much power. "No man owns you. Not him, not me, not anyone. If you walk away from me, I will not stop you. But if you choose, I will walk beside you, and no hand will ever rise against you again." The girl stared at his hand, her breath uneven. All her life, choice had been denied her. She had been told what to do, who to be, whom to marry. She had been treated as a tool for her father's ambition, as property to be bartered. And now, in the midst of her shame, someone had given her the one thing she had never been granted, the freedom to choose. Her fingers trembled as she lifted her hand. The crowd leaned in, their breath caught in anticipation. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, not possessive, but protective. A surge of strength pulsed through her as he pulled her gently to her feet. She winced at the pain, her body weak, but she stood taller than she had in hours. The warrior's words had already sealed the moment, but her choice confirmed it. The tribe had witnessed her humiliation, but now they witnessed her rising. Not alone, but shielded, seen, valued. The Apache turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the finality of a vow. From this night forward, she walks with me. Not as property, as equal. As mine and I hers. The people stirred, some nodding, some still whispering, but none dared challenge him. The father stood frozen, his authority shattered, his pride bleeding out before the eyes of his tribe. His daughter had slipped from his grasp, not because she was stolen, but because she had chosen to step beyond his shadow. The warrior guided her from the circle, his hand steady around hers, their steps slow but certain. The firelight flickered behind them, but ahead stretched the dark, vast plain beneath a sky filled with stars. For her, those stars seemed brighter than they ever had, each one a reminder that freedom, though fragile, was possible. And as the warrior walked beside her, she knew the night that had begun with her humiliation had ended with her dignity restored. The night air was sharp, cool against the girl's bruised skin as she walked away from the circle of firelight. Every step she took beside the Apache warrior felt like crossing an unseen boundary, from the world of humiliation she had always known into one she had never dared imagine. Her body ached from the beating, her spirit was tender from the sting of public shame, but something inside her had shifted. Where despair had lived, hope now began to flicker. The warrior's hand around hers was not the grip of a captor, but the anchor of someone who stood beside her, unshaken and unyielding. Behind them, the camp buzzed with murmurs, the people whispering about what they had witnessed. The father had lost face, his fury crushed under the weight of a man's courage and a girl's choice. Some whispered that traditions had been broken, others that justice had finally found its way into the heart of the tribe. No matter what was said, one truth could not be undone. The girl had been lifted from shame and given back her dignity in front of all. As they walked into the shadow of the trees, the girl's legs buckled. Pain surged through her ribs and she nearly fell, but the warrior steadied her. He lowered her gently to a fallen log and crouched before her. "Rest," he said softly. His voice, though firm in the circle of confrontation, now carried the gentleness of a river flowing after a storm. He studied her face, the swelling of her cheek, the dried streaks of tears. "No more will you bow your head in shame," he added. Her lips trembled. "Why did you do this?" she whispered.
Why risk everything for me?
He held her gaze, unflinching. "Because no one should suffer at the hands of those meant to protect them. I saw strength in your eyes even as your father tried to break you. A spirit like yours deserves freedom, not chains, and I—" He paused, searching for words heavy enough to carry truth. "I could not stand silent while cruelty paraded itself as honor." Tears welled again in her eyes, but these were not born of pain. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her not as property, not as a burden, not as an extension of her father's pride, but as herself. The warrior's words had carved a space inside her where self-worth could finally take root. The stars glittered above them, and the forest around them whispered with life. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the chirping of crickets. It was as if the world itself had paused to witness this turning point. Back at the camp, her father sat in silence, the whip at his side, his pride bleeding into the dirt. His authority had been shattered in front of his people, but more than that, he knew he had lost something he could never regain. His daughter's trust, once fragile, was gone, and with it the unquestioned obedience he had always demanded. Though he seethed in rage, deep inside a seed of shame began to gnaw at him, not because he had been challenged, but because for the first time he was forced to see his cruelty mirrored in the eyes of his people. The tribe itself was changing. The elders whispered of balance, of whether traditions built on domination could truly survive. The younger ones, especially, had seen something new. A man who defied authority not with rebellion but with honor, and a girl who dared to choose dignity over fear. For the girl, redemption came not in her father's repentance that she did not expect, but in the fire that began to glow inside her heart. She remembered every lash, every insult, every public shaming. But now she also remembered the moment she took the warrior's hand and stood tall despite her pain. That memory would live longer than the scars. The warrior, seeing her strength grow, leaned close and spoke. "Tonight you were broken in body, but not in spirit. That is why you endure. You are not weak, you never were. And now no one can take that from you again. His words struck deep. She realized that redemption was not simply about being saved by someone else. It was about reclaiming herself. The warrior had given her the chance, but it was her choice, her courage, that lifted her from the ashes of humiliation. As dawn painted the horizon with strokes of gold and crimson, they returned toward the edge of the village. The people who saw them step into the light of morning did not see the beaten girl they had pitied the night before. They saw a woman walking upright, her bruises unable to dim the dignity in her stride. Beside her walked the Apache, strong and unyielding, his presence a silent promise of protection. The crowd parted for them. Some bowed their heads in respect, others in shame for not having spoken sooner. Even the elders, though troubled, could not deny what they saw. A girl who had risen from degradation to dignity, because one man had dared to say, "Now she's mine," not as possession, but as protection. The father stood at the far side, his eyes bloodshot, his pride still bleeding. But when his daughter's gaze met his, something inside him faltered. For the first time, he saw not a child to control, but a woman who no longer feared him. And in that moment, his authority crumbled into dust. The girl and the warrior continued forward, leaving behind whispers, judgments, admiration, and resentment. None of it mattered. What mattered was that she was free to walk a path chosen not by force but by her own will. And as they disappeared into the horizon, the story of that night became legend. Mothers whispered it to their daughters as a promise that no cruelty was unbreakable. Young men remembered it as a challenge to what true strength meant. And the girl, now no longer nameless in her own story, carried the memory of her redemption as a flame that would never be extinguished. Her father had beaten her before everyone, hoping to break her. But it was the Apache warrior who stood and said, "Now she's mine." And in that vow she found not ownership, but the strength to claim herself. And that, at last, was her redemption.